Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Miller Center. It's great to see so many of you here and so many familiar faces and friends and students and faculty. I hope you're enjoying your lunch, and I hope you're enjoying coming back to the Miller Center. My name is Will Hitchcock. I direct academic programs here at the Miller Center, and I also teach in the history department. This has been an extraordinary week at the Miller Center, and I just want to take a moment to boast. Not that I had anything particular to do with it, but I'm happy to take the credit. It has been one of the busiest and most exciting weeks I think we've had in a long time. The week began with a visit from presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont. And like him or not, one thing that we can say about Bernie Sanders is he's really touched a chord among some American primary voters, and especially among young people. When it was announced that he would come here to do a taping of the American Forum show in this room, this was going to be a very restrained semi-public event in a small room. About 300 students were waiting for him when he got here outside on the front steps. And they'd been waiting there for 4 hours just to get a glimpse of him. He did walk out and address them briefly to hoots and hollers and cheers. It was really exciting, and it was exciting to see so much vitality amongst our students with respect to the presidential contest. And this is one of the things I think the Miller Center can do, is serve as a platform for students and the community, faculty, and occasionally a presidential candidate to meet together. 2 days later, a historian, Kevin Cruz, came through and spoke about the connections between the Republican Party and evangelical Christianity, and that was a talk that ranged from the 1950s up to the present. And then yesterday, 9 of the nation's most promising and talented young scholars arrived here for a 2-day conference. These are men and women who are completing their doctoral dissertations at the leading universities across the country. They competed in a national competition to get a Miller Center Fellowship. They are amongst the best and the brightest in the country. They won a Miller Center Fellowship, and it allows them to spend a year finishing up their doctoral dissertations and preparing to turn those into books. The Miller Center plays a very important role in pushing them the last mile to get them prepared for playing a role in public life, in the academy, or in public service in some way. They are truly exceptional young scholars, and I just wanted to take a moment and ask if the fellows who are in the room could just stand real briefly and say, just stand, and we will recognize you, wherever you all are. Yeah. As Jerry Seinfeld said in a different context, make no mistake, they're here to replace us. And finally, this amazing week is capped off by a visit to the center from Professor David Kennedy, one of the country's leading historians of American history, someone I personally have admired since I was a graduate student. He's a friend of the center. He's spoken here before. He's participated in conferences and served as an outside reviewer of our academic programs. He's a towering figure in the historical profession, and it's a privilege to have him here today. Now, as many of you know, we have a formula for these lectures. My colleague Brian Ballow is going to come up and introduce David Kennedy, and then Professor Kennedy will speak, and then both of them will sit up here for about 15 minutes and have a sort of mini conversation about some of the topics that have been raised in the lecture. And at that point, we will open the floor up for questions. We do have a standing mic in the back, and we ask you to use that standing mic. We also ask that if you would like to ask a question, that you actually ask a question. And you know who you are. So let me begin then. I'll turn the podium over to my colleague in the history department, Brian Ballow, who will introduce our guest. Brian is well known to many of you as a terrific historian, as the director of the National Fellowship Program, and the guy who always parks in the front of the circle at the front of the Miller Center. He may also be known to you as a co-host of the nationwide radio program Backstory with Ed Ayers and Peter Onuf. He's become a UVA institution, and he's certainly one of the reasons why coming to the Miller Center is so much fun. So, Brian, please come and introduce our guest.
Thank you very much, Will, and thanks for organizing this just terrific series of first-rate scholars talking about very, very important political issues. Thanks for your kind introduction. I've observed that when people are called institutions, it's usually a sign that it's time for them to retire, but I'm not going anywhere either, Will. David Kennedy is the Donald McLaughlin Professor of History, Emeritus at Stanford University. He's the author of numerous books and articles. Among them, and among my favorites, are Over Here, The First World War in American Society, and Freedom from Fear, The American People in Depression and War. Here's where the fact that I used to play the French horn comes in, because I'm now going to mention only a few of David's prizes, but to get through that list, you really need a good set of lungs. He won the Pulitzer Prize, the Francis Parkman Prize, the Bancroft Prize, and the California Gold Medal for Literature. And believe me, those are just a few of the awards that he has been given. Now, my graduate students know that I like to study historiography, and that's the history of history, and I'm kind of known for being able to fit any historian into the right box, into the right category, which is what we like to do in academia. David has completely confounded my abilities to fit his work into any category. That's because it's truly transcendent. He is a brilliant synthesizer who writes about poetry, but also writes about bureaucracy. He writes about public policy, but he also captures the zeitgeist of the times. He is a remarkable wordsmith, yet one always leaves David's books with no doubt about what the takeaway is going to be. And I suspect we're in for a real treat today, and you will leave this room not only knowing more facts than you knew about the topic, but having a different view of things when you leave as well. Probably all these things have been said about David before, so I had to dig a little deeper, and I got in touch with 4 eminent scholars in their own right, who happen to have been connected with the Miller Center in different ways, to say a few words about David. And these are primarily people who were trained by David or worked as his colleague. Bruce Schulman, who has served as a mentor for past fellows numerous times and is the William Huntington Professor of History at Boston University, said, quote, "David Kennedy was my mentor, my dissertation advisor, and as I and numerous others, many of them now prominent historians in their own right, can attest, David fulfilled that role with his customary excellence, serving at once as critic, coach, and confessor with skill and aplomb." Lisa Cobbs, who's the Melbourne Glasscock Chair in American History at Texas A&M, and formerly a mentor for these kinds of fellows, said, quote, "David asked a little group of new graduate students that included me, 'What's the most important question you can ask?' Well, we fumbled with answers all over the map of American history, and then after it got quiet, David said, 'No, no, no. The most important question is, what's the meaning of life?'" Doing so, Lisa continued, not only taught us history, but added to the meaning of our own lives, end quote. Margaret O'Mara, a former fellow in this National Fellowship Program, who got her first job as an assistant professor at Stanford and worked with David in the center that he founded there. And Margaret, who is now an associate professor at the University of Washington, writes, quote, "David is the fastest walker I know, and he has complete confidence that any companion can keep up with him. That's an apt metaphor for his broader influence on those who have been his students and colleagues. He pushes us to set a more ambitious pace and believes quite fully that we can do it, whether it be writing groundbreaking scholarship, engaging new audiences, or just walking a little faster." And finally, Joe Crispino, former Miller Center Fellow, who's now chair of the History Department at Emory University. Quote, David Kennedy is probably the coolest person I know. Listen carefully, David. Not the coolest historian or academic, that's a category we sometimes get in. Not the coolest historian or academic, just the coolest person in general. He's the full package. Beloved teacher, distinguished scholar, renowned public intellectual, and the guy who will order a cocktail before dinner in such an elegant and precise way that all you can think is, I'll have one of those too. David, welcome to the Miller Center.
Well, thank you, Brian, for that exceptionally generous introduction. And if I may, I'd like to ask for a copy of that. I want to show it to my kids because the things that were said about me there are not what they say. And thank you, too, Will Hitchcock, for getting me here in the final leg of this journey, which was a little more colorful than I anticipated. And Bill Antolis, thank you for your stewardship of this wonderful institution. And thanks to all of you for being here. My subject is this afternoon is Franklin Roosevelt, but my parallel subject is also the matter of history itself. History is a way of understanding the world and of acting in it, and I hope it'll become a little more clear what I mean by that rather abstract statement as we go along. But I began to think about things this way as a result of a conversation I had now some 20 years ago with the famous philosopher and historian Isaiah Berlin. I was at Oxford University and was introduced to him. It was a great privilege to me. He's a great philosopher, a great historian. And I was then writing Freedom from Fear, and he said, "Oh, you're the man who's writing this new biography of Franklin Roosevelt." Well, I was flattered he knew anything about me at all, but he didn't have it quite right. And I said, "No, Sir Isaiah, in fact, I'm not writing a biography of Franklin Roosevelt. I'm writing a history of the United States during what happens to be the term of his presidency. But it's not a biography at all, though I must say that he is such a powerful personality that it's sometimes a temptation for me not to succumb to the power and allure of that personality and write a biography anyway." And Isaiah Berlin grabbed me by the arm. He was a little homunculus of a man. He looked up at me and he said, "Oh, my boy, succumb, succumb." Well, what I took him to mean was that in his view, Franklin Roosevelt was one of those rare personalities who really could correctly be understood as a world historical figure. Someone whose presence on this planet really did make a difference in the lives of many millions of people. And I'll return to this at the end of these remarks. Historians, as a rule, don't like to think this way, but in some ways I think it's legitimate for us to at least indulge ourselves for an afternoon in thinking of Franklin Roosevelt in this particular manner. So my subject, Franklin Roosevelt, like all of us, was a complex person, only more so. And it befell him to live in and largely preside over an unusually complex historical moment, a moment that embraced the sequential dramas of the Great Depression and World War II. So for simplicity's sake, I will speak mostly here today about the Depression. But I want to say at the beginning that first the prospect and then ultimately the reality of World War II defined much of the framework within which Roosevelt's life must be understood. Franklin D. Roosevelt was one of two men, the arcs of whose respective lives trace out the distance between the brightest glories and the darkest evils of the 20th century. The other man, of course, was Adolf Hitler. They never met, though their lives, as it happened, rather uncannily paralleled one another's and at last fatefully intersected. They were men of the same generation, bred in the same era, born, in fact, in the same decade. Roosevelt in 1882 and Hitler just 7 years later. And eerily, as if conforming to the plotline of a Gothic novel, their lives ended within days of one another. Roosevelt's on April 12, 1945, Hitler's on April 30th. And both died before seeing to its climax, the Great War, that Hitler had raven to launch and that Roosevelt had struggled to convince his decidedly reluctant countrymen to fight, in a war that would shape the fates of nations and peoples right down to our own day. Each in his own country had come to supreme power within the span of a few weeks from one another. Hitler was installed as German Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, and Roosevelt was inaugurated as President of the United States just 35 days later, on March 4th. Both achieved office by means of democratic elections. Both assumed the leadership of industrial states commonly afflicted by the catastrophe of the Great Depression, an economic meltdown that disemployed 1 in every 4 workers in Germany and the United States alike, the two countries most grievously stricken by the economic crisis of the 1930s. Both began their time in office by asking to be judged on their record of success or failure in doing battle against the Depression. Both were ultimately judged on other grounds altogether. The one, Hitler, universally condemned in the history books; the other, Roosevelt, almost universally praised and not infrequently beatified. So I recite the shared history of these two men because it's imperative, I think, to understand that all of Roosevelt's presidency unfolded under the shadow of Hitler's chancellorship. All of the events that compose the great chapters of Roosevelt's biography and constitute his claim on our historical attention: the drama of the 100 Days, the battle against the Great Depression, the great social and economic reforms of the New Deal, Roosevelt's struggle against isolationism, the agony of uncertainty about Europe's fate and America's relationship to it in 1940 and 1941, and of course the waging of World War II itself. All of these great events played out against the menacing backdrop of Hitler's dictatorship and the looming threat and eventually the armed challenge of Nazism. Roosevelt's challenges and achievements, as well as his failings, simply cannot be understood, I believe, outside of that context. But if the parallels between these two lives are instructive, so perhaps even more so are the contrasts. In the spring of 1933, both men had just come to power. Roosevelt was coaxing the 100 Days legislation out of the American Congress, wooing the labor unions upon which he would build the fabled Roosevelt Coalition, and finding innovative ways to use the radio, brand new electronic communications, mass communications medium, to reach beyond the hostile print media magnates who controlled the nation's newspapers. In those same months in 1933, Hitler was turning the Reichstag into his personal instrument, dissolving the German trade unions and Nazifying the German press and the universities. Soon he declared the Nazis the only legal political party in Germany and began to impose a reign of terror on the German people, the likes of which this country has mercifully never known. A year later, 1934, while Roosevelt was worrying about a possible political challenge from within his own party by Louisiana Democratic Senator Huey P. Long, Hitler simply dispatched his main Nazi rival, Sturmabteilung leader Ernst Röhm, by having him summarily executed. The following year, 1935, the year of Social Security Act and the Wagner Act, reforms that ushered millions of Americans into the mainstream of national life, including especially those from the great immigrant communities that had arrived a generation or so earlier. In that same year, Hitler codified his policies against the Jews in the Nuremberg decrees, stripped them of their citizenship, excluded them from the professions and military service, and prohibited marriage between Jews and Aryans. So the same era, men of the same generation, inhabiting comparably developed countries with a largely shared heritage of beliefs and values and experience, facing the identical economic crisis, but two entirely different responses from two different leaders and two different legacies for their peoples. And these differences, I think, tell us volumes about the historical cultures that produced these two men and about their two individual personalities. Now, speaking of technology, can I make this work too? Somebody want to help me out here? How do I advance this? Oh, there we go. Okay. So all personalities are mysterious, I think, in the last analysis, often even to their very possessors, a axiom on which Woody Allen has built an entire career. And few more so, I think, than Franklin Roosevelt's. Francis Perkins, who was his longtime collaborator in New York State reform politics and for 12 years his Secretary of Labor, remained baffled by him to the end. In her memoir, she called him the most complicated human being I ever knew. And many other commentators famously underestimated or downright misunderstood him. The fabled pundit Walter Lippmann called him in 1932, during the 1932 campaign. Lippmann called Roosevelt a kind of amiable Boy Scout. In a column that was destined to become notorious, Lippmann offered his considered opinion as follows. He said, Franklin D. Roosevelt is a highly impressionable person without a firm grasp of public affairs and without very strong convictions. He is an amiable man with many philanthropic impulses, but he is not the dangerous enemy of anything. He is too eager to please. Franklin D. Roosevelt is no crusader. He is no tribune of the people. He is no enemy of entrenched privilege. In a sentence that was destined to become famous, he said, he is a pleasant man who, without any important qualifications for the office, would very much like to be president. Now, perhaps the most telling and yet somewhat opaque appraisal of all, and surely the most succinct because it doesn't contain even a predicate, was allegedly delivered by the venerable Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. On the morning of Roosevelt's first inaugural on March 4th, 1933, the president-elect Roosevelt made a courtesy call at the Washington, D.C. home of the 92-year-old Justice Holmes. And when Roosevelt departed after taking tea and exchanging a few pleasantries, supposedly, Holmes turned to his law clerk and offered this famous appraisal of his visitor. He said, a second-class intellect, but a first-class temperament. We're not really sure that remark was ever uttered, but it's one of these stories that historians fall in love with, whether it's true or not, because it so perfectly captures something important. So what was that temperament, and what shaped it? I want to suggest that 4 words capture much of its essence. First word is absorptive, the second is sunny, third is a compound word, self-confident, and the fourth and most mysterious and challenging for us to understand is responsible. So let's start with absorptive. Virtually all of Roosevelt's associates at every stage of his life testified about his boundless appetite for knowledge and his remarkable capacity to assimilate it, though also many of them remarked that he apparently never, ever read a book. Conversation was his craft and his natural medium for absorption of knowledge. He could, in the modern idiom, talk your socks off. And in a not-so-modern phrase, many a visitor to Roosevelt's Oval Office left figuratively discalced. But he could listen, too, and his mind may have appeared to some observers to be disorderly, but all agreed that it was prodigiously well-stocked. Adolph Burley, one of the original brain trusters and one of the many people who found themselves awed by the range of Roosevelt's interests, put it this way. He said he had an almost universal interest. There were few fields of knowledge with which he had not contact, many in which he was expert, but in all he had a vivid interest. Nothing was alien to him. Rexford Tugwell, another one of the original brain trusters, claimed that FDR, quoting him now, could see more in an hour's drive than anyone I had ever known. He noted crops, woodlands, streams, and livestock. To ride with him was to be deluged with talk, half practical, half fanciful. So Roosevelt might have been born into a highly privileged and sheltered enclave of our society, but unlike so many members then of his social class, he was no smug, self-satisfied parochial country squire, his orbit of interest defined by country clubs and golf courses, as he might easily have become, but a man with insatiable curiosity about the world and apparently unslakable interest in other people from whatever walk of life. And as for his disposition, that word sunny, the record overflows with testimonials to his infectious optimism, his charm, his enveloping garrulity, and with his uncanny ability to project that vibrant personality through skillful employment of what was then the very newfangled medium of the radio. One observer noted that he was all light and no darkness, and somewhat more ambiguously, the noted literary critic Edmund Wilson appraised Roosevelt as a man, as he said, of slightly unnatural sunniness. Now, that sunniness had political consequences. When Roosevelt delivered his first fireside chat at the end of his first week in office, again a testimony to his practical utilization of the radio as a tool of governance and politics. When he gave that first fireside chat on March 12, 1933, millions of Americans heard the voice of a master showman. He spoke in a tone that was at once cultivated and yet not condescending, commanding yet avuncular, masterful yet intimate. And that chat did as much as any of the preceding week's flurry of legislative initiatives to calm the nation's jittery nerves and, though difficult to document, to win the hearts of his countrymen. But here's an attempt to document just the effect of that first fireside chat. In the following week after March 12, 1933, some 450,000 Americans wrote letters to their new president. Many of them laboriously penciled in tortured syntax on school children's lined paper and on butcher paper. You can read these at the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park. And it was the first installment of an avalanche of correspondence to the White House that remained the case for the remainder of his time in office. The White House mailroom in Herbert Hoover's time, 1929 to 33, had been staffed by a single employee. The Roosevelt administration had to hire 70 people just to handle the unsolicited mail from ordinary citizens. Dramatic testimony, and in a way quantifiable testimony, to the unusual, still mysterious bond of intimacy and affection that FDR somehow established with millions of Americans. With the possible exception of his cousin Theodore, Roosevelt might be said to have created the first charismatic presidency, in which the power of personality, amplified by radio and instantaneously accessible all over the nation, was self-consciously deployed as an instrument of governance in the age of mass democracy. Now, self-confidence. It's been said of Roosevelt that his utterly untroubled conception of the office of the presidency consisted quite simply in a mental picture he had of himself in it. And indeed, his administrations arguably created the benchmark definition for the office for virtually every president who has followed him. And I have more to say about that self-confidence and some of the problems it bred in a moment. But suffice it to note here that at times he did indeed verge on committing the sin that the Greeks called hubris. And again, I'll have more to say about that in a moment. So the sources of that extraordinary self-confidence have posed a difficult challenge to many, if not all, of Roosevelt's biographers. But pursuit of that particular question brings me to the fourth of these temperamental traits that I've mentioned, and the one that I've described as the most consequential as well as the most elusive, and that is his sense of responsibility. People have tried to describe it in various ways as a sense of patrician duty or an ethic of seigneurial solicitude with which he embraced his political career. Now, much of that sense of duty, of patrician obligation, noblesse oblige, whatever we want to call it, was instilled by his parents, who doted, we know, on their only child. And this theme of noblesse oblige was sternly reinforced by his schooling at Groton, that egregiously Anglophilic nursery of a gaggle of distinguished civil servants who came of professional age in the Roosevelt era, including future Attorney General Francis Biddle, future diplomat and governor Averell Harriman, future Secretary of State Dean Acheson. Groton was then headed by its legendary headmaster Endicott Peabody. It subjected its young pupils to an almost monastic discipline of Spartan living, hard study, and endless imprecations to don the mantle of public service. And later, with what I can only regard as typically high Anglican understatement, Endicott Peabody described FDR as, quote, a quite satisfactory boy. So under the circumstances, it was all but inevitable that FDR would enter public service. Here he is campaigning for vice president in 1920. Apparently, indeed, he never contemplated any other career. He set out from an early age, told his friends and associates from an early age, that he intended to trace his distant cousin Theodore's path to the White House. And he managed with remarkable fidelity to step precisely in Theodore Roosevelt's footprints, with the exception, of course, that Theodore was a Republican and Franklin was a Democrat. But he first became a New York State Senator in 1910, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the Wilson administration, the Democratic Party's vice presidential candidate in 1920, governor of New York in 1928, and finally election to the presidency in 1932. And along the way, he further deepened his association with cousin Teddy by marrying Theodore Roosevelt's niece, Eleanor, and at their wedding in New York in 1905, the Reverend Endicott Peabody presided over the nuptials, and then President Theodore Roosevelt gave away the bride. So Theodore Roosevelt more or less voluntarily relinquished the presidency in 1908 and always regretted it. FDR took the point. He once said that no man ever willingly gives up public life, no man who has ever tasted it. And he did not, plotting even after being stricken by polio at the age of 39 in 1921, how to manage his return to politics, an endeavor in which Eleanor served as his legs. She traveled to maintain his contacts within the Democratic Party while he tried to learn to cope with his paralysis. And in the process, as we now know, she matured as a woman and as a public figure in her own right and as a significant political actor in her own right. So many people have speculated on the impact of Roosevelt's paralysis on his personality. And I suppose intuition would strongly suggest to us that the shock of such a trauma befalling a vibrant, athletic, active 39-year-old man must have been transformational in some dramatic way. Yet second thought reminds me, at least, of the great American psychologist William James' assertion that every person's character, said James, is set in plaster by the age of 30. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, thought that the man the boy would become was evident and pliable by the age of 7. Sigmund Freud set the defining age of personality at about the age of 3. And modern geneticists emphasize biochemical and inherited factors that mold our basic temperaments even while we are still in utero. And indeed, it seems to me that FDR's illness did not so much transform his character as confirm it. He faced polio with the same traits of self-assurance, optimism, and tenacity that his childhood had nurtured and Endicott Peabody had drilled into him. And in turn, coping with polio strengthened and possibly even distorted those same traits. Like many people with disabilities, Roosevelt developed a talent for a kind of denial, a forcefully willed optimism that just refused to dwell on life's difficulties in his own circumstance. It was this same aura of radiant indomitability that he managed to communicate to the American people in the darkest hours of the Depression. And in that sense, it might be said that polio proved to be some kind of political asset, the modern-day equivalent of the log cabin conventions of the 19th century that established his connection with the underprivileged common man. But this same capacity for willing into being the reality he chose to inhabit also, I think, abetted his penchant for duplicity, as when he continued his love affair with Lucy Mercer, even after he had told Eleanor in 1918 that the relationship was ended. And as it happened, when he died at Warm Springs, Georgia in 1945, it was Lucy Mercer, not Eleanor, who was at his bedside. This same sense of robust self-confidence, verging, as I said earlier, on hubris, appeared in other chapters of Roosevelt's life as well, notably in his failed effort to pack the Supreme Court in 1937, an episode that effectively ended the New Deal. It appeared again, ultimately I think to better effect, when Roosevelt defied all his advisors and bet on Britain's survival in 1940. And again, more about this in a moment. So, once elevated to the White House, true to his declaration that no man ever willingly gives up public life, Roosevelt served longer as president than anyone in history, re-elected 3 times. And in yet another demonstration of his capacity for willful self-delusion, in my judgment, he also clung to the office well after he had lost the physical and mental capacity for the job. He was, in short, a politician, and nothing else but. With trivial exceptions, he spent his entire adult life either seeking or occupying public office. He was a lifelong professional politician, a savvy and seasoned practitioner of the political arts, and unapologetically so, one among many reminders that he plied his trade in an era whose sensibilities were different from our own, especially as regards the virtues, rewards, and merits of public life. Now, contrary to much mythology, both then and later, Roosevelt also had, in my judgment, a coherent view about the purposes of public life and his own political mission. And to return to something I said at the outset, most importantly, in my view, he had as well a coherent view of history. He made a shrewd appraisal of the vectors of development that had deposited him and his countrymen at their moment in time, a rendezvous with destiny, as he once famously called it. And he made a no less shrewd appraisal of what possibilities the great change, for change, the great engines of history might now be compelled to yield if they were skillfully managed. Now, Roosevelt was not the only person who was trying to make sense of the historical meaning, the causes and consequences of the Great Depression. Many people in this country and elsewhere appraise the crisis as not simply another downturn in the familiar business cycle, but instead as the gory, operatic climax of a long historical epoch, a disaster that at one and the same time tolled the knell for capitalism and for liberal democracy, and heralded the onset of utopian or alternatively draconian regimes of the left or right, communist or fascist or Nazi, on the Stalin model or the Mussolini model or the Hitler model, but in any case, regimes that regarded free market capitalism, liberal democracy, and freedom as bankrupt, hopelessly obsolete historical artifacts. The distinguished British economist John Maynard Keynes reminded Roosevelt of those possibilities in a famous open letter to the president published in the New York Times on the last day of 1933. He said, "You," addressing Roosevelt, "you are the trustee for those in every country who seek to mend the evils of our condition by reasoned experiment within the framework of the existing social system. If you fail, rational change will be gravely prejudiced throughout the world, leaving orthodoxy and revolution to fight it out." Now, Keynes, I think, was, not alone in this, of course, was some kind of genius and a compelling historical figure in his own right, but he was no Abraham Lincoln. Yet in this passage, in that letter he wrote to Roosevelt, it seems to me he struck a note quite similar to the note that Lincoln sounded with such clarion simplicity in the Gettysburg Address. That whether in the 1860s or in the 1930s, America's fate was not just America's, that the United States stood at those critical historical moments as the last best hope of mankind. That the present crisis, Keynes was saying, was testing not only American society and American political and economic institutions, but testing whether, to go back to Lincoln's language, any nation so conceived and so dedicated could long endure. That what was at stake was nothing less than whether the dream of government of, by, and for the people shall perish from the earth. So complacent orthodoxy would not do. Reform was essential. Without it, as Keynes said, a moribund but entrenched old regime would be left to contend violently with revolutionaries of the left or of the right. Or again, as Lincoln put it in another context, the dogmas of the quiet past were inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, so must we think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we will save our country. Now, I would submit to you and invite your reflection on the notion that knowing when such a moment has arrived, a moment when our case is new, when we must think anew and act anew and disenthrall ourselves, recognizing such a moment is one of the priceless gifts of historical study and historical knowledge. So disenthrallment of his countrymen is what Roosevelt as president now undertook to accomplish. And the result is what history knows as the New Deal, a set of institutional reforms and attitudinal changes about the role of government that have defined the terms of American life ever since. Now, for a long time, it was commonplace for historians, including some very well-respected historians, to observe that the New Deal had no system, that it was a hodgepodge of makeshift policies that added up to no coherent whole. The eminent historian, a man I much admire, Richard Hofstadter, perhaps taking his cue from Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., once said rather disparagingly that, quote, "at the heart of the New Deal, there was not a philosophy but a temperament." And a writer in the New York Times trotted out something like that old chestnut again as recently as January of 2001, when he wrote that Roosevelt, quote, "threw a slew of policies at the wall, and whatever stuck became the New Deal." Now, many writers have criticized this apparent lack of system. Others have praised it as in keeping with the highest traditions of American anti-doctrinaire pragmatism. Both those views, in my judgment, are wide of the mark, because in my view, there was a coherent philosophy to the New Deal and a system to it, and its overall achievements, in my judgment, cohere in a pattern that, in my reading, fairly leaps from the pages of the historical record. And the pattern is so clear, to my eye at least, that it can be summarized in a single word, and the word is security. Indeed, I think it's altogether fitting and proper that the emblematic reform that even a casual student of history associates with the New Deal was the Social Security Act of 1935. Security was the New Deal's gift to many sectors of American life, to capitalists and consumers alike, to workers and to employers, to corporations and farmers and homeowners and investors and bankers and lenders and builders as well. Job security, life cycle security, financial security, market security, however it might be defined, achieving security, reducing the risk and uncertainty of everyday life, or what Roosevelt called reducing the hazards, or protecting people from the hazards and vicissitudes of life, a phrase he used repeatedly. That was the leitmotif of everything the New Deal attempted, everything that lasted. That we have had nothing resembling the Great Depression since the New Deal, not even, in my judgment, not even close, the so-called Great Recession of recent years, nor anything resembling the savage cycle of boom and bust that characterized the American economy for a century before the 1930s. Those historical facts, it seems to me, point strongly to the conclusion that the New Deal has to be judged, grosso modo at least, as some kind of success. The New Deal gave to millions of Americans who had never had much of it a sense of security, and with that came a sense of having a stake in their country. As Roosevelt himself once put it, "We are going to make a country in which no one is left out." And in that simple sentence, it seems to me, Roosevelt summed up much of the New Deal's intent and its accomplishment. Like his own rambling, comfortable, yet notably unpretentious home on the banks of the Hudson River at Hyde Park, the New Deal shaped a society in which millions of Americans found at last a measure of the security in their own lives that the patrician Roosevelts had enjoyed as their birthright for generations. Now, before I get carried away in praising the New Deal's success at imparting a measure of security to American life and thereby demonstrating the continuing vitality of liberal democracy, I want to acknowledge that the most conspicuous of the New Deal's failures, and that is, quite simply, it never managed to find a cure for the most urgent crisis of the time, the Great Depression, and especially its most human face, unemployment. Unemployment averaged 17% for the entire decade of the 1930s. It never went below 14% during Roosevelt's first two terms. And those numbers, I might add, do not adequately reflect the human face of unemployment in that era, when the demography of the workforce was altogether different from what it is today, because in the Depression era, as it had been for decades before that, the typical household had one wage earner in it, not two. So a 17% unemployment rate effectively meant that 17% of households were without a wage earner. A 17% unemployment today would not translate into a comparable percentage of households. The unemployment rate stood at 15% as late as 1941, before the even greater crisis of World War II compelled government spending on a level that swiftly extinguished unemployment and definitively wrote an end to the Depression. But there's an interesting relationship, often unnoticed, in this mixture of economic success, political success and economic failure. And I might be able to illustrate what I mean by this relationship by another comparison of Franklin Roosevelt with yet another major figure of the 20th century, someone whose name is usually not mentioned in the same sentence, paragraph, chapter, or book as Franklin Roosevelt, and that's Ronald Reagan. In my view, the second most consequential American president exceeded only by Roosevelt in the 20th century. So consider the following. Let's begin first with their physical similarities. Both men stood 6 feet 2 inches, and at their fittest in their adult lives, both of them weighed 190 pounds. Both of them reached the White House after having served as governors of the most populous states of their respective eras, New York in Roosevelt's California in Reagan's. Both campaign on pledges, first of all, to resolve what appeared to be the most urgent economic crisis of their moment, the Depression in Roosevelt's case, and huge budget deficits in Reagan's case. And both failed, and to balance the federal budget, I might say, incidentally, or not so incidentally, and both failed to achieve those objectives. Reagan failed spectacularly to end federal budget deficits, and in fact, on his watch, the federal debt grew by some $2 trillion. Franklin Roosevelt became named the first woman cabinet secretary, Frances Perkins, and Reagan named the first woman Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. Both were masters of the highest tech mass communication media of their time, Roosevelt the radio, Reagan the television. And here's the real important point about this comparison, both turned economic policy failure into lasting political triumphs. Now, by that I mean, first of all, with respect to Reagan, where Reagan failed to balance the budget, to repeat, spectacularly failed to balance the budget, but left behind a Himalaya of debt that overshadowed all dreams of expanding the welfare state for at least 2 decades, thus achieving what arguably was his highest political objective, which was to slow or retard the expansion of the Great Society or welfare state. So too did Roosevelt's failure to end the Depression provide him with the indispensably necessary political space to achieve the lasting reforms of Social Security, the National Labor Relations Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Securities and Exchange Act, the Federal Housing Authority Act, and so on. So one test of the logic of the argument I'm trying to make might be to ask, if Roosevelt had somehow found the solution to the Depression by, say, the end of the 100 days in the spring of 1933, would there have been a New Deal with all its lasting historical consequences as we know it? Every one of the items I just mentioned, which have shaped the institutional, attitudinal, and behavioral landscape of our society for generations, every one of them dates from 1934 or after. And if the economy had been immediately restored in 1933, it is at least arguable that politics, too, would have reverted to business as usual, and the United States would not have had what Roosevelt later called his rendezvous with destiny. That is, its chance to seize an historic opportunity to tame at last the volatile and destructive demon of unbridled, let-her-rip, no-holds-barred capitalism, whose unchecked gyrations had ravaged lives and fortunes for nearly a century before the 1930s. Now, I might add here, not so incidentally, that when Roosevelt spoke, as he did so eloquently in his second inaugural address, which I invite you and urge you to find online, it's easy, Google Roosevelt's second inaugural address. It's a short document, you can read it in a few minutes. But when he spoke, as he did in that address, of the 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, and ill-nourished, of the millions denied education, recreation, and the opportunity to better their lot and the lot of their children, if you read that address carefully, or even minimally carefully, you will understand that he was not, repeat, not at that moment, speaking primarily of the victims of the transient crisis of the Great Depression. He said at the beginning of that address, it was 1937, the unemployment rate was the lowest it had been for the entire decade, 14%, much better than the 25% when he came into office. And at the beginning of that address, he said, our progress out of the Depression is obvious. And then a few paragraphs later, he said, but these signs of economic recovery could be portents of political disaster. Now imagine that, a president in his inaugural address boasting on the one hand about economic recovery, but then warning that economic health might be political disaster. It's, I think, a statement without parallel in the annals of official presidential statements. And if you read the address, as I say, minimum care, it's only then that he mentions the 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-nourished, ill-educated, and so on. And he is clearly speaking not of the victims of this transient crisis of the 30s, but of a huge sector of American society that had been permanently marooned on the edges of the great banquet of American life. It is in this context, I think, that I have suggested that Roosevelt understood history. Not just the history of his own immediate time, but of all the gathering forces that had deposited him at this moment in the 1930s. Okay, one last comparison with Ronald Reagan. Both men were, in the last analysis, conservatives. And about Reagan, the point scarcely needs elaborating, but the term may seem curiously and inappropriately applied to Roosevelt, the father of American modern political liberalism, the man damned from the conservative pulpits of his day as that man, or a traitor to his class who allegedly aimed at nothing other than the shredding of the inherited fabric of American life. But in the longer light of history, it seems scarcely arguable that, in fact, Roosevelt was no revolutionary. Walter Lippmann had that right. But he was a reformer, very different breed of cat, who conserved capitalism, saved capitalism, by exercising the political instruments of liberal democracy to temper its excesses, control its abuses, make it a more stable mechanism, and thereby give it a prolonged lease on life. Now, some critics, both then and later, have argued that there precisely is the rub, that Roosevelt either willfully or unwittingly botched some opportunity to slay the capitalist dragon once and for all and usher in the long-awaited collectivist utopia. The head of the American Socialist Party, Norman Thomas, at the time, in the 1930s, once put the point this way when he was asked by a journalist if it were not true. He said, isn't it not true, Mr. Thomas, that the New Deal has carried out the entire program of the American Socialist Party? And Norman Thomas replied, yes, it has, on a stretcher. Now, that argument never had much plausibility in my mind, and it surely has little now. But indeed, subsequent history points strongly, I think, to the conclusion that Roosevelt's New Deal tested the leftmost limits of American political culture and could not reasonably have been expected to go beyond them. And from that perspective of a renewed appreciation of just how deeply it is embedded in our political DNA to be suspicious of government, particularly the federal government, and to be a cussedly individualist society. From that perspective, we might say that while it is extremely difficult to imagine the New Deal having done more, it is quite easy to imagine it having done less, and therefore incumbent on us to acknowledge the singularity of its achievement. Now, Roosevelt is routinely ranked among our quote-unquote greatest presidents. For example, a recent C-SPAN poll of several dozen historians placed Roosevelt second only to Abraham Lincoln in the list of presidential greats. C-SPAN used its own rather complicated scoring system to produce that result, but for simplicity's sake, let me suggest a three-part test by which to measure presidential achievement. It's a test that is modeled on a formula similar to all fans of detective stories. You might recollect when Perry Mason set out to identify a murder suspect, he regularly asked three questions. Did the alleged perpetrator have the motive, the means, and the opportunity to commit the crime? If the answer to all three was yes, Perry had his man, the protocols of, or his woman, the protocols of detective fiction were satisfied, and we were all contented as readers with the order and justice of the world. So the inquirer, after a working definition of presidential greatness, might reformulate the Perry Mason motive, means, opportunity device to read vision, skill, and circumstance. Did the president in question possess the vision and the political chops, and did history provide him the circumstance in which to exercise those attributes to justify a claim to greatness? In the case of Franklin Roosevelt, the answer to each of these questions, I believe is emphatically yes. Indeed, the answer to the last question about circumstances is yes, yes, because he faced not just one but two great crises that tested his mettle as few leaders have been tested, the back-to-back calamities of the Great Depression and World War II. In the face of each, of each of those, he had both the vision to make the most of his opportunity and the skill to achieve that vision as a leader who employed the arts of persuasion, not strong-arm or dictatorial tactics, to convince people to follow him. So time, or rather the lack of it, I guess, prohibits an extensive discussion of Roosevelt's role in World War II. But let me make just 2 points about that. This is the meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill in Argentia in 1941. So the first point I want to make about Roosevelt and his relationship to the war has to do with those crucial months between Hitler's invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, customarily taken as the starting date of the Second World War, and America's entry into that war more than 2 years later with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. This was a time of huge and fearsome uncertainties, especially after France rather ingloriously genuflected in front of Hitler's blitzkrieg attack in June of 1940. Would Britain now survive? And after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, to the still unresolved question about Britain was added another: would the Soviets survive? Would the Wehrmacht defeat the Red Army in the field, or would Hitler compel the Kremlin to accept a humiliating political settlement and shut down the Eastern Front? And most urgent of all, for Roosevelt, how could the United States manage to put its weight in the scales in favor of those peoples who were trying to stand up to Nazi aggression? On May 15th, 1940, the brand new, freshly installed British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, formally asked President Roosevelt for help in the war against Hitler. What should or could Roosevelt do in that moment? The American people, I think sometimes largely mislabeled the greatest generation, were at this moment still decidedly isolationist. What was more, opinion polls in the summer of 1940 showed that fully 2/3 of them did not believe that Great Britain would endure. Roosevelt's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Joseph P. Kennedy, no relation, cabled him that aiding Britain at this hour would, this is Kennedy's words now, would leave the United States holding the bag for a war in which the Allies expect to be beaten. It seems to me that if we have to fight in order to protect our lives, we will do better fighting in our own backyard. And that was not just Kennedy's idiosyncratic view. The United States Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall advised Roosevelt on May 18th, quote, "We cannot afford to submit ourselves to the delay and consequences involved in accommodating the British government." And just to complicate things further, 1940 was a presidential election year, not the kind of situation that usually stimulates political courage. Yet in the teeth of all that contrary advice, and despite those circumstances that might have restrained him, Roosevelt and Roosevelt alone insisted on diverting American military production to the British, on transferring to them 50 World War I-era destroyers to aid in the defense of the English Channel, and on revising the neutrality statutes then on the books so as to extend $7 billion in so-called Lend-Lease aid to Britain, and soon thereafter the Soviet Union as well. So here's another episode where we might see what might be called the virtues of hubris. A less self-confident man might have yielded to his advisors and to the manifest isolation of his countrymen and to the political circumstances of an election year, and kept the United States out of the war for the time being. But here, just as he had seen the opportunities for reform in the darkness of the Depression, so too did Roosevelt have a vision of what terrible consequences history might impose on a nation that did nothing at this critical juncture. On June 10th, 1940, speaking at the commencement address of this university, the University of Virginia, Roosevelt said the following: "We cannot survive as a lone island in a world dominated by the philosophy of force. Such an island may be the dream of those who still talk and vote as isolationists, but that dream represents to me the nightmare of a people lodged in prison, handcuffed, hungry, and fed through the bars from day to day by the contemptuous, unpitying masters of other continents." Now, as I said at the outset, historians by temperament and training dislike emphasizing the role of the heroic individual in history. We're much more comfortable spouting abstractions like the spirit of the times. I think I even heard that phrase earlier today from Brian Balow's mouth, and things like the vast impersonal forces of history. And I must say, I subscribe to that approach. But that said, I must add that this is one moment when it is all but impossible to imagine history taking the course it did without the presence on the historical stage of this one man. So Isaiah Berlin, I think, had something correct when he reminded me or pointed out to me that perspective. Second point about World War II. When it did come time to fight, Roosevelt guided his people, this country, to victory along what economists might call the least cost pathway. Absolutely uniquely among all the belligerent nations in World War II, uniquely, the United States saw its civilian standard of living markedly rise during the war, the origins of a half-century of economic vitality that made the Great Depression a quaint historical memory and defined the secure, affluent world we lived in for 2 full generations after 1945. And though it is true that 405,399 Americans died in World War II, those losses, proportionate to population, were about 1/3 of Britain's and about 1/60th of the Soviet Union's, which lost 25 million people in the war. Small wonder that at the end of the war in August 1945, Churchill declared in a notable speech in Parliament, he said, he used a peculiar form of diction, rendering the United States as a plural noun, something we haven't done in American English for generations. But he said, quote, "The United States at this moment stand at the summit of the world." Germany, meanwhile, at that moment lay defeated and prostrate. Hitler had brewed a catastrophe for his people, so vast that it seemed to sunder the web of time. Germans would still call the moment of their surrender on May 8, 1945, Stunde Null, the 0 hour, when history's clock had come to a fearful halt. So Adolf Hitler and Franklin Roosevelt left those 2 very different legacies to their peoples and to the world. So I hope I don't want to be misunderstood here, having sought today to beatify Roosevelt and surely not to canonize him, but his qualities of intellectual curiosity, optimism, self-confidence, his deep understanding of history, as well as his willingness to shoulder weighty responsibilities, surely shaped his era and ours deeply. History must, in the end, credit him, I think, with about as close a thing to 3 miracles of leadership as any president can claim: wringing lasting and beneficial reform out of the crisis of the Depression, shepherding this reluctant people into what history can only judge on balance to have been a just and necessary war, and thirdly, achieving a victory that sheltered Americans from the worst of that war's ravages and positioned them for prosperity and international leadership for a half-century and more thereafter. And as presidencies go, that's a pretty impressive record of achievement. Thank you.
So we're going to have a brief conversation, and in about 5 or 10 minutes, I'll ask folks to line up at the microphones if you want to ask David a question yourself. Since we have such an eminent historian here, I want to ask you about the vectors of history today. If you were Franklin Roosevelt, you talked about Roosevelt's coherent view of history and ability to capitalize on his insight into the vectors of history. What are the vectors of history that are converging today, and what does this tell us about what we need in the way of presidential leadership?
That's a great question, Brian, but why don't you just reread your introduction? It only take 3 or 4 minutes.
Because I don't want to get your kids angry, that's why.
Then I can think of a good answer. Well, as you know as well as anybody, we have no data from the future, so we don't really know exactly what the future, we don't have any precision whatsoever what the future holds. But I do think that some of the identifiable vectors of history that are visible in the world today we were able to say something about them. One, I think, has to do with the new kinds of volatility that have been seeded into the international economic order through the great complex of forces that we call globalization. Something that really people in Roosevelt's era had to deal with at a much lower level of intensity and scale. And the capacity of singularly national institutions to regulate and tame and control and remove the risk from a lot of capitalist economies is seriously compromised just by the international global character capitalist dynamism today. So I think the world is searching for ways to exercise some kind of transnational or international stabilization over our global economic system in a way that is increasingly urgent.
Great.
Let me just add,
Sure.
since we're thinking historically, my
Yeah.
mind just went back to a famous historical formulation of this point, better said than I can, so I'll quote it. It's in something I'm not in the habit of quoting, the Communist Manifesto. But there, Marx and Engels, 1848, said something that I think is one of the truest statements made in the last 200 years since the onset of the Industrial Revolution about the character of the capitalist system. They anthropomorphized it. They said the bourgeoisie compels every people to conform to the capitalist mode of production on pain of extinction. And that has proved to be a powerful insight into the way industrial capitalism has worked its way around the globe for the last many generations since they were writing 150, 60 years ago. So we have a system now that encompasses different societies, cultures, geographies, political institutions, assets, all kinds of things on a scale that I don't think anybody has properly laid out for us and properly understands. So I think that's a major challenge for us and generations going forward.
Mm-hmm. I was struck in your comparison of Roosevelt, FDR, and Reagan with your emphasis on optimism. And in the very beginning of your talk, one of the qualities you mentioned was sunny. Watching the Republican debate a few nights ago, I didn't see a lot of sunniness, especially among the leading Republican candidate. In fairness, I don't see much of it on the Democratic side either.
Well, it's a curious situation, isn't it? No political candidate, I think, can hope for ultimate success by telling the American people that their lives are a mess and the future is gloomy, and I'm here to tell you that we're going to have to go through a lot more suffering. I mean, that's just not a message that commands...
You don't think Jimmy Carter's formula was a winning formula?
Well, the people who have taken that line, Jimmy Carter's one, more famously was Walter Mondale, who said in a debate that
I know I campaigned for him.
He was the person that was going to raise taxes. I'm here. Whoever's elected president will raise taxes. I'm the guy that's going to tell you about it ahead of time. We know what his fate was. So that's a very difficult thing for a political candidate to strike that note. And yet, candidates have to somehow criticize the party in power by pointing out their failings and so on. So there's the line they have to walk, is identifying the dark places, but pointing to the, as Lyndon Johnson used to say, the sunny uplands to which he will or she will lead them.
Any people who want to ask questions can start walking towards the back. I have one more question about Roosevelt and the New Deal himself. Could you say a little bit more about the way in which Roosevelt was able to pass all of this monumental legislation, given the very attitude against government, suspiciousness of government that you described in your talk? Tell us a bit more. You can pick a couple of examples. How did he do it?
Well, let me give a little bit of background. The United States was, of all the countries affected by the Depression, if we just take the metric of unemployment, which is a pretty good rough and ready measure for the severity of the crisis across all kinds of dimensions, the two countries most affected by the Depression were Germany and the United States. The whole globe was affected, but Germany and the United States were the worst in terms of unemployment. And the United States was essentially the last country to lift itself up out of the Depression. Not least of all because in a lot of other countries, the political will or the political culture sanctioned vigorous use of government power to counterpunch the Depression. So in this country, Roosevelt, unlike Hitler or unlike the British government or the French government, the Italian government, Japanese government, Roosevelt had at one and the same time to find the tools with which to do battle with the Depression and to convince a pretty skeptical public that it was the correct thing to do at all for the federal government to assume these kinds of responsibilities. Our schedule of values as a people, I think, has shifted somewhat. We're still quite wary of government, but less reflexively opposed to the government acting vigorously in the face of a crisis. Look at what both the outgoing Bush administration and the incoming Obama administration did to counterpunch to the so-called Great Recession, 2008, 2009. So we have shifted our schedule of values a bit, but again, amongst the countries of the Western world, or the industrialized world, the G8 nations at least, we have the smallest public sector, the smallest slice of GDP allocated to the public sector of any society with which we usually compare ourselves. So that remains the case. So Roosevelt had this compound task of legitimating what he was doing while trying to figure out what was the right thing to do in the first place. And I'm reminded here of a famous aphorism about, I don't speak Chinese, so somebody here can correct me if I got this wrong, but I'm told that the Chinese character for crisis is a fusion of the two characters for danger and opportunity. And you might remember what Rahm Emanuel said in the interim between Obama's election in 2008 and his inauguration. Emanuel gave a famous interview in which he said, "You never want a crisis to go to waste." And Obama, in the first big public interview that he gave in February of 2009, just a month in office, on the Lehrer NewsHour, Jim Lehrer laid out all these problems that were on his plate, and he says, "Isn't your plate just too full?" And Obama said, "No, this is when you want to be president, because it's only in moments like this, moments of crisis, that the system takes on enough flexibility, there's enough openness, you can actually accomplish something." Well, whether he did accomplish something in that moment or not, we can argue about. But it is a characteristic of our system. It's constitutionally embedded. We learned about it in the civics class when we were a lot younger as the system of checks and balances, but our founders gave us a system that by design, a political system is very difficult to exercise power in a coherent way from the center. And there are these rare moments in American history when a crisis shakes things loose enough that something can be accomplished, and I think that's what Roosevelt understood.
Well, I'm going to press you on that, though, because Hoover had a crisis, and things didn't work out so well.
Well, frankly,
I want you to tell us what it was that Roosevelt was able to do in order to take advantage of that crisis.
Well, just in terms of political craft, first of all, he was able to get his own party in control of both chambers of the Congress. Hoover, after 1930, faced a Democratic majority in the Congress, and they were not willing to let him do anything. So among the reasons that Hoover was unable to effectively counterpunch the Depression was because his hands were partly tied by Democratic opposition. Roosevelt managed, again, long, deep topic, probably not time here to go into it, but...
He's only written 1,200 pages to answer this question, so you're going to sum it up right now.
Well, Roosevelt had the advantage, the benefit of huge majorities in both chambers of the Congress. After the election of 1936, there were exactly 16 Republican senators left out of 96 at that time in the Senate. And when we ask, as people do, about Obama, well, why can't he get more done? Well, why can't he be like Lyndon Johnson or Franklin Roosevelt? Look what they did. Well, it wasn't just that they had more political vigor. They had huge majorities of their party in both chambers of the Congress, and boy, that's a big facilitating circumstance. But we could debate, people have debated, whether Hoover had a similar sense of the historical moment that he inhabited as Roosevelt. I think largely he did, as a matter of fact, but not quite enough to actually take him across that threshold where he could use the crisis, especially in the face of Democratic opposition in the Congress, to the effect that Roosevelt did. Hoover himself, in his memoirs, says something to the effect that he tells us how he had chafed while serving as Secretary of Commerce under Presidents Harding and Coolidge, who were far more conservative in their outlook than he was. He had been in Woodrow Wilson's cabinet. He had cast his first presidential ballot for Theodore Roosevelt in 1920. He was a progressive. And he believed in the measured, to be sure, but nonetheless positive use of government as a force to stabilize and make more prosperous the American people and the American economy. But he never had the chance. I mean, you might say Hoover and Roosevelt are handed the same lemon. Hoover sucks on it, and Roosevelt makes lemonade.
Well, let's turn to our audience. Mr. Toplin, you have a question?
Yes. I was so busy taking notes from your fascinating presentation that I didn't look up to see the images, and I just at the end caught, I guess the next to last one was perhaps from Yalta.
He analyzes movies, so you can imagine.
I know.
I'm interested in images, right?
He didn't look at the images.
Anyway, in that picture, I guess it was from Yalta perhaps, but
Yes.
Roosevelt looked terrible. And we now know from scholarship that during his last year, he was in very bad shape physically and sometimes mentally. And of course, some of the people recognize that if he were to be elected, he might not last a year or so. So as we look at it from the perspective of history, can we say that just as well, we still are happy that he was elected, even though he didn't have his faculties completely, and perhaps at Yalta he didn't do his best and so on? Or can you say that this is a sort of Wilson-type moment where we should not have had that man up for president?
Well, I do think it is one of the great sins he committed was to stand for re-election in 1944. He knew, he certainly should have known, and I think he did know, that he was already very incapacitated. It's where that maxim that he talked about no man ever willingly leaves public life, really becomes operational. And then the sequelae to that were terrible too, because he didn't really play much of a role in the selection of his vice presidential running mate, Harry Truman. Knew very little about him, really kind of left the decision to others, and then didn't inform Truman much about what the future held. Truman didn't even know about the atomic bomb. So it was a very irresponsible moment on his part, I think, to stand for re-election in '44 and then not to quickly educate Truman about what exactly were the circumstances at the war's conclusion and what should happen going forward. So I think it's one of the most culpable moments in his political career.
Doctor, is it on?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Dr. Kennedy, you partly answered my question without you realizing it, but I want to get you to elaborate on it, if you will. It gets to the Hoover issue, the Hoover question. And the question is, if Roosevelt had been elected in 1928 instead of 1932, what might we say about Roosevelt today? I think this gets to many of your key points when you talk about seizing the moment, taking advantage of the circumstances, the rendezvous with destiny. You know, would there have been a rendezvous with destiny, in your opinion, if Roosevelt was elected in 28 instead of 32?
Well, that's one of these hypothetical questions that is impossible to answer with any satisfaction. But what little evidence we have that bears on your question has to do with how Roosevelt conducted himself as governor of New York after being elected governor in 1928. And he was much more vigorous using the powers of government in the state government, New York, than Hoover was at the federal level. Now, there are federal constitutional reasons why that might be the case. But again, he expressed himself much more unapologetically about the duty, the responsibility, the necessity of government to take an active role in the face of a calamity on this scale than Hoover did. Hoover did have, at the end of the day, we have to admit, progressive as he was, I don't disagree with that, he had more severe ideological limits to his progressivism than Roosevelt did. It's a mistake, I think, to put Hoover in the camp of some old arch mossback conservative in the 19th century model. I think that is a mistake, but it's also correct to make some distinction between the degree of his commitment to progressive ideas and Roosevelt's. But here's a even more interesting, a comparably interesting speculation. What if Herbert Hoover had been elected president in 1920? Which actually is not an altogether baseless speculation, because people in both parties tried to recruit him to seek the presidency in 1920.
Very much like Eisenhower.
Yeah, he was widely regarded. John Maynard Keynes said of him, Herbert Hoover was the only man who emerged from the ordeal of the Paris peace negotiations, where he was advising Wilson, with an enhanced reputation. Widely regarded as one of the wisest, smartest, best-informed people in the world. And he did have at least some measure of progressive inclinations. Had he come to power in 1920, he may, we can only speculate, but he may have put in place enough new policies and practices that the Great Depression might have been averted altogether. That's a big speculation. Or that its impact could have been mitigated and the recovery could have been a little swifter. But again, these are things that didn't happen, so we can only guess what they might have been.
Great, thank you. At this point, I'm going to ask, even though Will is my boss, I'm going to ask people, to state your question, if you're okay with this, David, and we'll write the questions down, but give us your question and then David will answer them. in machine gun-like fashion.
You're going to write them down?
I'm going to write them down.
Oh, so we're not going to answer them individually. That's what
Exactly. But we'll go ahead and ask your question. Okay, sir.
In a few weeks, Richard Norton Smith is going to answer the question, is moral character an important quality in the presidency? That's my phrasing of the question. And I would like to ask that of you regarding Roosevelt.
Great. Thank you.
Is moral character an important quality?
We got it. Thank you. Barbara Perry.
Yes, hi. I have a question about populism. There was a little piece in the New Yorker recently comparing and contrasting the populist messages of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. You mentioned Huey Long at one point in your talk. Could you talk about populism and its message during the Great Depression and the Roosevelt era?
Terrific. And Sarah Seo, a Chuck McCurdy Fellow in Law and Politics, one of our Miller Center Fellows.
And I'm also currently working on a PhD in history. And I would have to say that we have not read a single great man theory type of history in grad school. But I was persuaded by your presentation this afternoon that Roosevelt makes a great case for a great man history. And so my question to you is, do you think Roosevelt was so unique that this type of history works for very few people like him, or do you want to revive this type of history that's kind of fallen out of fashion?
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Moral
character,
great man, right?
Exactly. And no great man in the Princeton PhD program reading list to put an edge on it.
Well, yeah, I to answer your question, sir, I think moral character is surely an important factor in deciding for us to judge in deciding who we should elect as president and to retrospectively judge how people did as president. My inclination is to say that it is necessary but not sufficient. That a good moral character, whatever that might mean, we probably have some rough agreement on what it means, is a pretty necessary ingredient in a political leader at that level, but it's not enough in and of itself to assure political success. There are a whole range of other attributes, some of which are not within the control of the individual, that go to his or her eventual success. So I think it's necessary but not sufficient. Populism, the question reminded me of something I read in a piece in Newsweek by Joe Klein within the last few weeks, rather snide comment. He said, populism is what passes for civic engagement amongst people who haven't been paying much attention. And
That could have come from your friend Hofstadter.
There's a tone to that remark that just unsettles me just a little bit, but it also, I think I'm just enough of an anti-populist, just enough, to take some of that on board, that if populism is nothing other than just a reflexive expression of and response to the whimsical and transient feelings of the public at large in their most agitated state, it's pretty dangerous. So I'm not that kind of populist. I do think we need representative government. We need people of good moral character to represent us. We need institutional constraints to guard us against our worst instincts, which can be agitated and activated pretty quickly, we've now come to understand. So that strain of populism is one that just makes me quite uncomfortable. If by populism we mean sensitivity to and responsibility for the real circumstances of common ordinary people in our society, that's my kind of populism. And
then we have this great question about how in a department with Sean Wilentz and Julian Zelizer, a brilliant young legal historian has not read any narratives about great leaders.
Well, let me repeat. I hope, I did not give the impression, I hope I did not, that I espouse the great man theory of history. It's long since discredited. On the other hand, I think Isaiah Berlin had something when he pointed out to me that in this particular circumstance, the fact that this individual, this man with this moral character, with these kinds of instincts about his responsibility to the public at large and to the world at large, was in a position of power, was enormously historically consequential. And had it been Herbert Hoover, who was reelected, or Alf Landon, or Wendell Willkie, or Thomas Dewey, it's an open question in my mind whether they would have done things of as comparably long-standing value as Roosevelt did.
Great, and only because he's my boss, we're going to take the last question from Will Hitchcock.
I'm not going to miss the opportunity. You're fired.
Thank you.
Thank you, Donald.
The Apprentice. One of the things that makes the 30s and 40s so fascinating is to historians and to students of history is that they're not just one sense of history, but that understanding history is a very political act in this era. And there are at least three other contending ideas of history going on at the moment that Roosevelt is forging his. There's a racial idea of history, that history is driven forward by racial conflict. That's Hitler. There's an imperial idea. That's Churchill, that basically empire is a good thing. We should sustain it. Progress moves forward when empires succeed. And there's, of course, an economic idea of history that Lenin and Stalin are allegedly pushing, which is that history is moved forward by economic conflict, and the revolution is going to bring the end of capitalism. You talked about Roosevelt's ideas of history, but what made him so confident that the American idea of progress in history could survive these headwinds of alternative ideas?
Well, as usual, an excellent question, Will.
Yeah, that's why he's my boss.
That's right. Again, I don't know that I can answer the question to your satisfaction about what exactly it is Taproot gave Roosevelt that kind of confidence in these particular propositions. But he certainly had it, and I guess by way of answer, I'd go back to just elaborate on something I said in my more formal remarks. I think he did have an international vision that addressed each of those alternatives you just talked about. It's evident at least as early as the Argentina Conference in 1941, when he and Churchill draw up the so-called Atlantic Charter, which becomes a kind of a high-level statement of their joint war aims, and that document compels Churchill to go back to the British Parliament, and when challenged about some of its anti-colonial, anti-imperial language, he said, "I did not become the King's first minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire," but that's exactly what happened. And I think a part of the Roosevelt story that, in my view, I hope you young scholars are listening, has not been adequately thought through and presented to us, is just how coherent was his vision for the future of the planet. The four freedoms immortalized by Norman Rockwell in that famous quartet of paintings, one needs to remember the four freedoms were originally articulated not as essential characteristics of American life, but as aspirations for what the world should become, the external world. So if you read the speech again today, he says our aim is freedom of speech all over the world, freedom of religion all over the world, freedom from want everywhere in the world, freedom from fear everywhere in the world. It's a foreign policy agenda. And that high-level thinking, I think, is embodied institutionally and in policy in things like the United Nations, the Bretton Woods agreements that create the International Monetary Fund, the creation of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the World Bank, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which comes out of the war period and becomes eventually morphs into the World Trade Organization. All these organizations that looked to bring a measure of stability and order and conflict resolution mechanisms to the international order, I think are part of his vision and his legacy.
Great. Well, thank you for this wonderfully engaging talk and questions. Thank you very much, Kevin.